were out patrolling the city when a call came over the air. Squad 126, report to 924 North 25th Street and investigate a head in the refrigerator.
When police returned to arrest the man, there was a struggle, and the uniformed police officers made the horrific discovery: dismembered human remains, decapitated heads in a refrigerator freezer, limbs and male genitals in other containers, and a large barrel full of acid. Experienced homicide detectives say the killings have a sexual component. The male victims allegedly killed by a 31-year-old man, Jeffrey Dahmer. Apparently, cannibalism is an element in this case.
Could be your next door neighbor, that nice person next door. You would never suspect them of doing this sort of thing.
To these men, 10 minutes of pleasure is worth more than the other person's life.
We know they don't stop killing because they have reached a quota and they don't want to kill anymore. This is something they have to do.
These are human beings whose only way of relating to another human being is through dominating, terrorizing, humiliating, and dispatching them. These are, to use the scientific word, scum.
The compulsions that drive the serial killer have been the subject of major studies by investigators, scientists, and psychiatrists. Is it a form of madness? Fewer than 2% of serial killers are found insane. So what creates from the boy next door an individual whose every waking thought is murder? This program builds a model developed at California State University which demonstrates the complex interaction of forces which led Jeffrey Dahmer and others who've lived amongst us to kill and kill again.
We know that everybody in the world has a capability of killing another person. Anybody can pull the trigger on a gun, poison somebody, push somebody off a cliff. We all physically can do these things, but not everybody has the capacity to kill. And that capacity is developed through a process.
So I go down and make the coffee mixture with Irish cream in it. Some standard 7 pills. And drug him. Half hour later he falls asleep and I strangle him there in bed. You know, I mean, people can say, well, it was family pressures, or it was outside forces, or it was mental disease, but the fact is that I'm the one that did it, not just once, but time after time. Very self-destructive life.
The process which made Jeffrey Dahmer a serial killer is shown in our model. Many of us might experience one or more than one of the individual factors, but it's only very rarely when all these factors are combined that a truly dangerous individual is produced. The first important factor which our model indicates is that some of us may be born with genes that predispose us towards violence. The world's largest study of identical twins who've been separated at birth is showing which parts of our behavior are genetic and which parts are caused by our environment.
One thing that we find is that the identical twins, separated in infancy and reared apart, turn out to be just as alike, not only in their appearance, but in their personality, in their interests, even in some of their social attitudes, as identical twins who have been reared together and spent most of their lives together. We know that the degree of aggressiveness that a boy child will show beginning early in life and continuing on through life owes about half, 50% of its variation to genetic variation. It's probably related to the level of circulating male hormone in the blood, which in turn is related to genetic factors. We know that the degree of fearfulness or fearlessness that people show also owes at least 50% of its variation to genetic factors.
Genetic factors play a role, but there are other physical factors like brain damage, which can also predispose people towards violent behavior.
Well, just a little neuroanatomy to begin with. Here are the front of the frontal lobes, and here are the front of the temporal lobes. And in the middle part of the temporal lobes is the hippocampus. Hippocampal gyrus is just inside there, and that is part of the so-called limbic system. limbic system is the anatomic locus, and this is somewhat oversimplified, of instincts, drives, feelings of sexuality, aggression, and the frontal lobes are supposedly mainly inhibiting and tend to inhibit those instincts and drives. Now, the brain has a consistency of jelly, and the skull, of course, is very hard. And when there is head trauma, the jelly-like brain goes cracking up against the skull. The MRI scan shows the brain. This is of a murderer who had killed 2 people in a particularly brutal fashion, having overkilled them, stabbed them 100 times each. He had been involved in a horrendous automobile accident at age 16 and had been in an intensive care unit for several weeks and had been unconscious for several days. His family said that his personality had changed somewhat and become much more explosive after that. And you can see that in the subcortical frontal white matter, there's an abnormality. There is this little spot, which seems white here. I would attribute this quite confidently to the trauma that he had sustained. He shows a lesion that's quite similar to it on the other side. And so this fellow has the equivalent of bifrontal leucotomies. His behavior was quite typical of people who have that. He was uncaring about the consequences of what he had done and was in fact uncaring about the execution which was impending.
As well as predisposing factors, a serial killer usually suffers traumatic events during childhood. Experiencing sexual and physical abuse will cause severe trauma. Other traumatic events are more commonplace. More than 1/3 of children in the United States are brought up in broken homes, and many children experience feelings of neglect. It's only when traumas such as these are combined with other factors in our model that they might lead to deviant behavior, and in the most extreme cases, perhaps to serial murder. Jeffrey Dahmer was brought up in an affluent Ohio community with many advantages. His father was a PhD research chemist, and the family home stood in 2 acres of woodland. What traumas might have affected this young child and aggravated a possible predisposition for violent behavior?
He remembered undergoing a surgical procedure when he was, I think it was either 4 or 5 years of age. And he recalled being in extreme pain and actually asking one of his parents whether or not his genitalia were still present given the pain that he was experiencing in the genital area. That had some significance to me because oftentimes people who have paraphilia will recall, and when I say paraphilia, I mean a deviant sexual interest pattern, will recall some form of pain or injury, in a sense, to their body.
Like many serial killers, Jeffrey Dahmer also suffered traumas which intensified his deviant tendencies. His mother had a series of nervous attacks and a breakdown. His father was often away working, and the marriage was destined to end before Jeffrey grew up and left home.
It just didn't seem like my parents really liked each other too much. Arguments, fighting, it just made me feel on edge, unsure of the solidity of the family. I know she was in the hospital for about a month. A mental, ward. And Dad was busy working. I decided early I wasn't ever going to get married, because I wouldn't want to go through anything like that.
Certainly he did come from, by many folks' standards, a privileged background. It was a family that was well educated, that put a value on education. It was, by many standards, an industrious family. But as he recollected his childhood, there were long periods of time of emotional isolation, of him being unable to bond with other people.
Most of us have had traumatizing experiences as children. We grow up, we become ordinary citizens. And yet there are some children who have traumatizing events. Divorce in their family, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, physical abuse, dysfunctional families, alcoholism in the family. And they grow up and they become serial killers. And there's a quantum leap between somebody who is raised in a dysfunctional family and then growing up and becoming a serial killer.
In some cases, trauma leads to a process of so-called dissociation. The child defends himself by suppressing all emotional feelings towards family and friends.
Maybe I started shutting down to save myself the pain of what was going on. It was effective. It worked. Ever since then, I've never been a real emotional person.
What else could have aggravated Jeffrey Dahmer's feelings of isolation?
The boys that he tried to associate somewhat did not accept him fully. And I would also say that from time to time they would tease him and somewhat make fun and ridicule him.
He always seemed pretty nice to me, like he didn't make fun of nobody, and he wasn't, you know, like a lot of high school kids are cruel, just go out of his way to pick on people. Or I don't think he was too popular, though. I don't think nobody really liked him. He's kind of what they call nowadays a nerd.
When the child has become dissociated from the world which he feels has rejected him, it reinforces his trauma, and he begins to develop fantasies of an imaginary world in which he's powerful and in control. These comforting fantasies become the most significant factor in the child's subsequent development.
It's hard to be a child, and people pick on children, and other kids are merciless. And so children develop various defensive strategies. One is to fantasize the power to retaliate against one's enemies. Hopefully, as the child matures, he acquires better coping mechanisms that don't rely on impossible fantasies to achieve an adaptation. In Dahmer's case, he did develop better coping strategies from time to time, but also some that were far more deleterious, because he did in fact learn how to control other people, not because they'd been mean to him, but to serve a sexual need that he'd acquired. I don't think it's abnormal for a child to have fantasies of being able to zap his enemies. I think it's abnormal to carry those fantasies into adulthood.
For people who cannot deal with their own inner struggles, their own inner monsters, if you will, those own feelings, the feelings of low self-esteem, the feelings of hurt and pain, those feelings will fuel those fantasies, so you're fantasizing more and more. And as you fantasize more, the fantasies become more violent, more specific, more oriented toward those who are less powerful than you. Donald Harvey is a very good example. Here's a man who, when he was at the age of 5, as a child, at the age of 5, was sexually abused by an uncle and by a next-door neighbor. Now, for the next 13 years, he was being sexually abused by these men. They threatened him. They told him that if you ever tell, we will hurt your mother. He loved his mother. He was never going to tell. He lived in terror. When his mother went to town to do shopping, he was alone. He knew at any time these men could come and get him, and they would just show up. Now we're going to abuse you. He was never in control of his life. At the age of 18, he got a job working in a hospital. And what did he do? That first year, he killed 12 people. And he was killing men about the same age as those who had been abusing him. They're actually transferring the fear that they've had in their own lives and have not been able to deal with constructively. They're transferring that fear onto other people. They want them to fear them. They want them to suffer. That's very, very important. It helps fuel their own fantasies.
Classic warning signs of dangerous fantasies turning to reality include fire setting and cruelty to animals. In each case, the child feels a surge of power as he controls forcibly his environment or subject. Jeffrey Dahmer was not outwardly cruel, but he had a fascination for the viscera of dead animals. He enjoyed the feelings of control while experimenting with the bones and intestines of those he found dead at the side of the road. To Jeffrey Dahmer, these dead animals became compliant objects of pleasure.
This beagle that got hit. Wanted to see what the insides looked like, so just cut it open. It was already dead. And wanted to do, I guess, something shocking with it. So I took it and stuck it up on a pole in the neighbor's wooded area.
Jeff said that it wasn't unusual for him to take squirrels and rabbits, dead dogs, and bring them home, use a knife to peel all the skin off of it, all the flesh off of it, use various different chemicals to bleach the bones, and then he'd set them out and dry them out, and then try to reconstruct it. And then actually had a little burial ground next to the side of his garage where it was marked what what animal was buried in, each place. I find that bizarre. I mean, if my son was doing something like that, I'm sure I would have knocked him upside his head and told him to knock it off. For whatever reason, maybe the fact that his father was a chemist and was involved in chemicals, and the fact that Jeff took, interest in that was pleasing for his father. Like I'm pleased that my son has taken up criminal justice in college.
As the child goes through puberty and begins to masturbate, his sexuality becomes associated with elements of his fantasy.
He was a homosexual from his very first awakenings sexually. But the interesting part was, and he made this very clear and said it, that his very earliest sexual fantasies always were intertwined with killing or the cutting up or dismembering of bodies, and that they were together. Sexual and the killing were intertwined, and those are the words he used, that they were mixed together.
In the case of Jeffrey Dahmer, the most puzzling aspect of his sexual responsiveness, assuming that he was honest with me on this point, as I think he was on others, is how it was that there came a time he found himself sexually excited by the appearance of glistening viscera from his victims. I would trace the origins of that very unusual paraphilia to childhood experiences in which, at a time when other boys would masturbate to fantasies of the prettiest cheerleader in the school, Jeffrey Dahmer was having sexual arousal and masturbation while thinking, accidentally or otherwise, about the dissection of a fetal pig at school, about the dissection of dogs he'd found dead at the roadside. And that as he would have such ideas intrude into his sexual fantasies, he inadvertently conditioned himself to become aroused to some of that imagery.
The mingling of sexual desire with fantasies of power and control creates an appetite for increasingly violent sexual fantasies, which the individual feels the urge to act out. Jeffrey Dahmer's fantasy was very extreme, to have complete control over a totally compliant partner, an object of pleasure. This kind of desire can lead to necrophilia.
He reported that he had noticed a man who jogged along a road and he was attracted to him. He did not know how to meet this man except forcibly, so he devised a plan by which he would knock the man unconscious. He reported that he broke a baseball bat in half and waited on the side of the road for the man to come by. On that particular day, the man did not come by. I asked him what he would have done had he captured the man, and he told me that he would have taken him into the woods and laid down with him. It was at this point that Jeffrey's paraphilic fantasies began.
Well, why do you say that?
Because he told me that his fantasies then involved forcefully having complete control over someone, over another person.
In the same way that men learn to be leg men or breast men, or to prefer blondes or brunettes, some men learn to prefer corpses, children, or the suffering of another sexually. The mystery of how that happens is not entirely solved, but the fact that it happens is shown by such facts as these. In the UK, there have been a sufficient number of gas mask fetishists and Macintosh fetishists that there are pornographic magazines devoted specifically to those interests, and clubs through which such people can meet. Those do not occur in the United States because our raincoats are made of different material, and we've never had a time when all the women were wearing gas masks. In Israel, someday there will be gas mask fetishists because they did have such a historical exposure. It's not imaginable that there is such a thing as a gas mask fetish gene, or that there is a latex brain lesion, or that there is a Macintosh hormone. So it can't be something we've evolved as an abnormality biologically. The human must be capable, or at least some humans, of learning aberrant sexual responses.
The gap between fantasies of murder and murder itself is large. A potential killer uses facilitators, which decrease the distance and blur the division between fantasy and reality. Pornography, drugs, alcohol.
In order to get over his own inhibitions against doing these distasteful, disgusting things, he would drink himself to a state of intoxication every time. He could only kill if he were drunk. He could only dismember if he were drunk.
And if we could liken this to, say, people in the Nazi death camps in Treblinka, Dachau, and Birkenau, the actual men who were doing the killings, the death squads, they were given huge amounts of alcohol. They were always drinking in order to allow them to do it. They couldn't go out and just on their own and kill these people. They were constantly receiving alcohol. I think that alcohol takes away our inhibitions. But on that same note, by taking away our inhibitions, if I take away your inhibitions, that's not going to increase your capacity unless it's already there. I mean, you have to have the capacity to do it. And so what the alcohol does, it decreases our inhibitions and allows us to do what we've already prepared ourselves to do.
By the summer of 1978, Dahmer's parents split up and caused Jeffrey another terrible trauma. Jeffrey's mother was granted custody in the divorce proceedings, but she left, taking only Jeffrey's younger brother. He felt utterly rejected. This was the summer of his graduation.
The evening of the prom dance, it was kind of in a way, a disaster. First of all, he was pretty late, and he's rushing around, and he come to the door, and my father hated all boys. So here he is, and my father's at the door, like looking like a bulldog, growling, and just trying to, you know, hurry up and get out of there, but we got to be polite and talk. We didn't want to take pictures. My mother made us take pictures. The parents, that's the kind of guy you bring home. To the girls back then, the guys had longer hair, was in style, wire frame glasses, not the way Jeff looked.
At some point, if the potential offender does not find a way to vent themselves without killing, they're going to go out and actualize those fantasies, and they're going to practice it. They're going to go out and harm somebody. And by the time they get to that point, it's a very small step from the actual violent fantasy to the actual killing.
To me, it seems like he changed a lot after school because he did this. But when you really think about it, in reality, he didn't change a bit because he murdered his first victim when he was 18, like I think 3 weeks after the prom. So what he was is the same person, just putting a big disguise on.
Violent fantasies combined with the use of facilitators drive an individual to the very brink. What then is the trigger which finally propels him into murder? For some, it's an event which makes them angry. For others, simply an opportunity.
At one point, Dahmer's parents were out of town. Dahmer was driving the family car down a road nearby his home, and a 16-year-old young male, bare-chested, good-looking, narrow waist. The circumstances of his fantasy weren't before him. Dahmer picked him up, offered to bring him back to the house, entertained them for an evening, drank some beer, talked around, lifted weights. And Dahmer was in ecstasy that his fantasy had come true until the bubble burst. And the bubble burst when this young man said, well, thank you for the entertainment. I must get on. I have to hitchhike again. I have to get back on the road. I have to be down south in several hours. And Dahmer became terrified. He became panicked that his fantasy was over before it had started. And as the young man bent over to pick up his jacket, Dahmer crashed a weight bar down onto his head and murdered him. Dahmer said very matter-of-factly, had he not seen that young man that night at that time, when the parents were out of town, that the entire 17 homicides may never have occurred. Now, again, if that's reality, I don't know, but this is what the Dahmer had told me.
Dahmer masturbated over the corpse, then dragged it to the crawl space under his parents' house. He dismembered the corpse and performed sexual acts with parts of the body. 3 days later, he buried the remains in the garden.
So nothing's really been normal ever since then. It taints your whole life. You know, I didn't think it would, but it does. It taints your whole life. And I thought that I'd just try to live as normally as possible and just bury it, you know, the memory of it and everything. But things like that don't stay buried forever. But like a festering sore, it doesn't get better. It just gets worse until finally it ruptures.
Jeffrey Dahmer experienced tremendous excitement at having performed the act about which he'd fantasized for so many years. But afterwards he was appalled. The killing was a new self-induced trauma, which served only to intensify his low self-esteem and isolation. That made fantasies of dominance and control start all over again. he tried to suppress these feelings.
I think his drinking, the out-of-control drinking, the alcohol abuse, was an attempt to numb himself and to drug himself out of reality. And he would use sexually explicit material as a release to try and control his fantasies and the behavior.
Jeffrey Dahmer used pornography to try and control his impulses. But some serial killers are stimulated by material which few would find pornographic.
I think it is undoubtedly true that serial killers look for literature and imagery which they can find stimulating, but very often that is far removed from what we conventionally call pornography. The single book which has probably had the greatest impact on stimulating serial killers, or which they have used to justify their crimes, has undoubtedly been the Christian Bible, and especially the Book of Revelation, the imagery of which has an enormous appeal, especially to paranoid schizophrenics. Peter Sutcliffe made use of the imagery of the Book of Revelation in his defense, and this has been widely used. Clearly the Book of Revelation is not pornography, but as I say, it has certainly had a great deal more discernible effect on serial killers than any kind of sadistic or hardcore pornography.
I once consulted with a man who had inadvertently conditioned himself to be aroused only to images of women tied up. And the way in which this had happened was that at the age at which he was looking for sexy pictures to use for masturbation, he went through his father's possessions, and all he found were copies of an outdoor magazine called Field and Stream and copies of a U.S. form of entertainment known as detective magazines. At that time, the detective magazines typically had on the cover a sexy-looking woman with her skirt hiked up or her blouse opened, who was bound and threatened by a man with a weapon. What happened to this man is that as he masturbated to the sexy aspects of the picture, he found himself arousable only in the presence of bound women. And this became inconvenient to him as he started to date. And so he sought help in changing this pattern of behavior. And it's no coincidence that when we are able to search the possessions of sexually sadistic serial killers, we find that many of them have collections of detective magazines, or at least their covers.
The significance here, of course, is what you see is the fear on the victim, the fear on the face of the victim. The knife here is to her throat. It can be a knife, it can be a gun, it can be a bag placed over her head, a plastic bag, it can be a rope around the neck, but there's always an intimidation on the part, usually of a female, with a male aggressor. The male aggressor's face oftentimes is out of the picture. If his face is in the picture, it's oftentimes concealed, or it is not necessarily visible, maybe from the side view, etc. But the fact is that there's that look of fear, there's a little bit of sexual implication, not nudity, but possibly clothing aside. In this case, you just have some deep cleavage and some prominent breast features, but that look of fear, that knife, and that invisible man. Every time we see that male figure, the offenders that have told me they are the aggressor. And if they saw a clear, defined face, facial feature, it would ruin their fantasy. A normal person might say, well, a police officer is arresting this young woman. Apparently she's been involved in some crime and he's taking her in. The sexual sadist, the sexual killer would say, this guy got himself a policeman's uniform. He has identified himself as a police officer. He's placing handcuffs on this woman who thinks he's an official law enforcement officer, but truly he's going to take her and sexually assault and rape her and use this as a guise.
One serial killer was a policeman. When arrested, Officer Gerard Schaefer was found to have adapted images from detective magazines and seemingly benign naturist publications to create his own custom-made pornography.
This picture is very interesting because the individual chose to doctor up this young lady here and putting a rope, putting a noose around her neck and tying her ankles. Consider for a second that the look on the face of these two young women are smiling. They're happy. This woman looks something less than happy. Their hands are in front of them. Her hands are behind her. And in this fantasy of this individual, he pictures her to be tied up, hands behind her back, noose for her neck, about to be hung. So again, he's taking a normal picture and converting it to a sadistic, a pornographic picture. Again, one of the pictures taken by the individual himself depict a hanging.
Gerard Schaefer hanged this woman. His violent fantasies of murder had become a reality.
So you see some very strong parallels here between the development of the fantasy and the actual acting out of the crime against another human being, all based on that fantasy of the detective magazine.
Some of the material which Dahmer found most stimulating had a universal rating at the cinema.
He had two kinds of films that were important to him. The first were male homosexual pornography of a very ordinary kind. The second were certain science fiction type films that he had watched repeatedly, namely a scene in The Exorcist 3, a scene in Hellbent Hellraisers 2, and a scene in Return of the Jedi. In each of those films, he had picked a part in which a powerful figure is able to do things to other people to control them. And he would watch that scene over and over before going out to cruise for a victim.
After the murder of Stephen Hicks in 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer struggled to control his fantasies of murder for 9 years. He enrolled at the University of Ohio. He flunked out after only 1 term. His father, realizing his son needed discipline, encouraged Jeffrey to join the army. After 3 years, he was released because of constant alcohol abuse. He moved in with his grandmother in Milwaukee and found work as a mixer in the Ambrosia Chocolate Company. In the struggle to control his fantasies, his behavior became more abnormal.
He took a mannequin from a department store, thinking that if he had that mannequin with him and sleeping in bed with the mannequin, etc., that maybe he could control the impulses that way. And he also attempted to dig up a body, a deceased person's body, thinking that perhaps that would be a way in which he could control the behavior. But his control ultimately broke down.
Dahmer began to attend gay bathhouses, where he drugged other members in order to have sex with their unconscious bodies. In March 1987, he received a 1-year probationary sentence for exposing himself to minors. 8 months later, Dahmer's deeply rooted drive to murder once more overtook him.
I was drinking at the 219 bar. It's a gay bar downtown on Water Street. And it was closing time. And I saw this white Caucasian guy, probably 5'10" or 5'9", 130 pounds. Looked attractive to me, so I asked him whether he wanted to go back to the hotel with me. I had a room at the Ambassador that night. And he said yes.
He thought nobody would elect to be with him. And the only way he could be with someone, you know, is to capture them, to drug them, and to kill them.
His drink had the sleeping pills in it, about 7 pills. The next morning I woke up and he was lying there on the bed, dead. His chest area had been crushed. So apparently sometime during the night, I had been beating him on the chest with my both fists, because my fists were bruised. I have no memory of doing it. Just remember waking up, laying on top of him, and the complete shock. Couldn't believe it. And so in the afternoon I decided I'd get a suitcase, a large suitcase with wheels on the bottom. Put him in the cab and drove home to Grandma's residence.
And to know the body's downstairs in a suitcase while you're up there with your mom, your stepmother, your father, your brother, and your grandmother, and maybe I think his aunt was there, he told me. A lot of nerve. A lot of nerve. This is 2357. This was Grandma's house.
The following Sunday, my grandma went to church, and I took the body out. Using a sharp knife that I bought somewhere, I stripped the flesh off the bones, put it in 3 plastic hefty bags, and threw them out in the trash as well.
Grandma had asked him several times about the weird smells that were coming from the basement. His father was alerted to this by Grandma and actually came out and looked into the bags, according to Jeffrey, and asked Jeff, hey, what's up with this? And to that, Jeff's explanation was that he had found some more roadkills and had done some experimenting with cutting the skin off them and cutting the meat part off to reconstruct the bone structure, and then he became bored with it and threw it out. And his father, he bought that because he had done the same thing in Ohio as a child, so it wasn't anything unusual to his father for him to do that.
The murder of Dahmer's second victim started the whole process again. This resulted in low self-esteem, which led to ever more urgent control fantasies, the further use of facilitators, and a renewed drive to murder. The more Dahmer killed, the more he needed to. With each murder, Dahmer experienced both the thrill of total control and the trauma which created the need for it. He was trapped in a vicious circle.
Something broke through, and I started the long slide down even faster than before. I mean, before it was just one, and then years went by, then this one, and then the next one happened in January of the following year. So about 2 months went by. And as I was on my way to the bars, I met this young man. Asked him if he wanted to make, I think, $50 to spend the night with me. And he said yes. And then it was getting towards daybreak. I knew my grandma would be waking up, and he still wanted him to stay with me, so I strangled him.
Jeffrey Dahmer admired tremendously his victims. He was choosing those he thought had an approximation to Adonis. He wanted to find the most perfect male forms, and he was affectionate for at least that person as an object. And so to him, these were greatly valued objects. Now, he may have dehumanized them, as all offenders do to their victims, but it was not a matter of hatred. It was a matter of trying to keep with him that which he most wanted to have, which was contact with such attractive males.
So that he could kill with greater ease and with less risk of detection, Dahmer moved out of his grandmother's house and rented his own apartment. Here, his activities were less likely to arouse suspicion.
The one individual that he brought home, the guy who was half Puerto Rican and half Jewish, he brought this fellow home from Chicago, and he lived with him for two days. And it was only when the guy said, hey, I got to go back to Chicago, I got to get back to my life, that Jeff finally did him in. But as long as he stayed there and laid up with them and participated in everything that Jeff wanted him to participate in, he didn't kill him. It was only after the guy said that he was going to leave that Dahmer killed him.
Dahmer's desire for control led him to try and create totally compliant sex partners by drilling holes in his victims' heads to render them zombies.
And how far down do you think you penetrated with a drill bit?
All the way to the brain.
2 or 3 inches?
Yeah.
And you went
2
straight
inches.
down?
Right.
The drilling holes in the skulls was a way in which he thought he could keep the person alive, keep the person with him, and have total control over this person. He felt himself to be a powerless person, powerless to attract people, powerless to keep people. And this would be one way, he thought, if he could render them zombies, then they would be under his control always.
Dahmer's increasingly desperate quest for control also led him to experiment with a further taboo.
In some cases, especially those offenders who have been involved with necrophilia, you'll find cannibalism. And it's not because they're hungry, I assure you. It's an issue of control. They want to totally dominate their victim. And so they'll eat part of their victim, and that way they have total, I own the victim now. They're part of me. And now I'm more powerful because I own them.
The way he stated it was he ate the flesh at first because he was curious, but then later on, not only did he keep that person with him, but he ate the person, and the person actually became part of him.
Dahmer, like most serial killers, took trophies from his victims. He photographed the dismemberment process and kept body parts which he used to reinforce his fantasies.
The trophy taking helps fuel the fantasies. It gives the offender a sense of control over their victims, and they'll go back and relive those fantasies by touching the trophy or reading about the trophy or reading in a newspaper clipping or touching the actual body part or the clothing.
There was only one of his victims that he kept every single part of, and he said this was the individual of all of them that he cared for the most, that he found the most appealing, the most attractive, so that if he wanted to, he could have effectively put this person back together again by just his bones.
Dahmer drew for me a picture of a shrine that he had fantasized building. He'd taken the step of buying a table, black lacquered, that he had in his living room. It was used as the base of a fish tank, but he hoped someday to be able to display on it skulls from his victims, 5 on each side. Next to the table, he hoped to be able to have the fully articulated skeletons preserved properly of 2 of his victims. And he wanted to have in front of that a black chair like the kind used in a scene he liked in Return of the Jedi by the powerful figure. And his idea, if he would ever be able to put it all together, was that if he could have his collection just so and sit in a chair just like that one, maybe he would be able to acquire greater power, feel more confident, be more effective in committing his crimes.
Dahmer was trapped in the cycle of trauma, fantasy, facilitators and murder, which serial killers are unable to escape. He cruised the streets, the mall, and the clubs with only one thought in mind.
It was an incessant, never-ending desire to have someone at whatever cost, someone good-looking, really nice-looking. And it just filled my thoughts all day long. It doesn't provide any lasting satisfaction or enjoyment or fulfillment.
Once an individual has started to kill repetitively for sexual purposes, they are sustained in that activity by the failure of each event to satisfy them sexually. The fantasy is that if they can only get it right, they won't have to do this anymore. But of course, it's never good enough. And the reason it's never good enough is that, truth be told, an orgasm is pretty much an orgasm, and it just isn't going to get any better.
For some reason, I just kept doing it. I mean, I knew my job was in jeopardy. All I would have had to do was just stop for several months at a time and space it out instead of... But it didn't happen that way. I just was driven to do it more frequently and more frequently. Couldn't control it anymore.
Dahmer's behavior became increasingly disorganized. He'd often not completed the dismemberment of one victim before he set out to kill another. He bought a 57-gallon drum to decompose the bodies in acid. His body count grew, he lost his job, but by now he hardly cared. His murderous cycle was now so frenzied that arrest became inevitable.
In the last week, he had lost his job. He was having to leave his apartment. He had no money. He had 2 corpses in the bathtub. There were 4 heads, 7 skulls, 2 skeletons. The place was a nightmare. And he knew he would have to get out in 2 or 3 days. But what did he do? He spent the entire day looking for somebody else that he could kill. Knowing, he must have known, of course he knew, that this would be it, this would be the end, and he would have to be stopped.
For many serial killers, arrest is the peak of their hideous career, the point where they finally achieve the power and attention they'd sought all along.
This is one of the surest routes in modern America, at least, to becoming a celebrity. Dahmer ended up on the cover of People magazine. So how else can a defective nothing be guaranteed a ticket to immortality than through such a ghastly and bloody career?
America produces a much greater proportion of serial killers than any other nation on Earth. Having discovered the complex network of factors which contribute to their development, what steps can we take?
most modern industrial nations are roughly the same. That is, their mortality rates, their morbidity rates, their all of their social indexes are roughly the same, except homicide. Homicide is one of the few rates that varies enormously. Now, my theory as an anthropologist says that part of the responsibility for this must be lodged in the nature of the cultural system. That is, the set of fundamental ideas about appropriate, acceptable behavior that people believe. And I, in my review of various nations, can find no other modern industrial nation that continuously transmits violence-glorifying messages to its population. It's clear that by the middle of the last century, the middle of the previous century, America had already in place a cultural system, that is, a set of beliefs that violence was a noble and valid and legitimate and masculine way of responding to a situation.
Serial murder is a big business. The producers of this program have recently received a letter in which Jeffrey Dahmer's father and stepmother have declined to be interviewed because of a conflict of interest with their current plans in Hollywood.
We have a popular culture that has made it formulaic to connect sex and violence. And we have a system of parenting, marriage, and divorce that leaves many young people without adequate parents in the first 3 years of their lives. When you have those two things together, it shouldn't surprise us that we assume a leadership role in serial killing. I think that the United States is going to do a fair job of exporting serial killings to the rest of the world as the entertainment industry opens new markets, and that Western Europe and Asia can look forward to having similar frequencies of this phenomenon when they've bought enough of our entertainment products.
In America, reports of true crimes were once confined to detective magazines and tabloid newspapers. Over the last 10 years, true crime formats have transferred to television with phenomenal results. The popularity of such programs has not gone unnoticed by broadcasters on this side of the Atlantic. True crime series now top the ratings on British television, and over the last 3 years, a disturbing market has been discovered for British true crime and detective magazines.
We're talking about the production of violence, violent acts, and violent actors. Now, how we begin to come to terms with this worldwide is an enormous educational process that has to begin in childhood and has to begin in many countries to rewrite the full force of 150 years of history. But in any case, we've got to begin to take seriously our mandate, not just to teach people what a hypotenuse is, but what a human being is and what the dignity accorded that human being should be.
The best thing we could ever do is require children in high schools to take parenting courses. Require them to take parenting courses, not as options. Look, anybody can get, to get a driver's license in the United States, you have to take driver's ed. Why not take parent ed? Take a parenting course teaching you some parenting skills.
Let's not wait until the person gets into the judicial system as a juvenile delinquent and then into the prison system as an adult to start looking for rehabilitation. By the time a person is in their teenage years, I believe their thought process is pretty much formulated. And I think experts would agree that it's probably earlier on in life that their concept of the world has already been formed. And if they believe that the world is against them, that society has rejected them, you are creating the serial killers of tomorrow, right now in the classrooms today.